Welcome to our event tonight. A reasonably small audience for a significant event. Who knew it was going to be almost 70 degrees today? Welcome to spring. So the title of our event tonight is Whose Freedom, Whose Speech? The Future of Community and Free Speech at the University of Maryland. The event is sponsored by PEN America, poets, essayists, and novelists, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at UMD. I'd like to briefly invite President Wallace Loh to the podium to welcome all of you and to our event tonight.
Thank you, Roger. And it's not the size of the audience, it's the passion and the intensity and the commitment of the audience that counts. And I'm looking forward to a very exciting panel and conversation with the audience. I would suggest that I'm going to request if we could all stand up for a moment of silence in respect to the tragedy that happened yesterday in Lakeland, Florida. Thank you. Please be seated. So I would like to thank our panelists. They will be introduced one by one, but it's a very distinguished panel dealing with what I considered one of the most important issues of our day: how to advance diversity and inclusion, and at the same time, how to advance freedom of expression, because that is absolutely essential to a university and to a free society. I believe very strongly that the university does not exist to make ideas safe for students. The university exists to make students safe for ideas. And this is also in the context of perhaps the most polarizing and divisive time ever in the history of this country, at least during my lifetime. Because what we're engaged in, given, of course, the rising tide of hate and bigotry and supremacy that we're seeing in this country, is nothing less than the struggle for the soul and the heart of this country, for the fundamental values that we stand for as a nation. That is the context in which this conversation will take place this evening. Again, I thank the panelists for coming here, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the discussion that will unfold this evening. Thank you again so much for coming.
Thank you, President Loh. Now, please join me in welcoming our introductory speaker tonight. Keith Boykin is a CNN political commentator, New York Times best-selling author, journalist, actor, and public speaker. He also teaches at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University in New York. Educated at Dartmouth and Harvard, Keith attended law school with President Barack Obama and served in the White House as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton, where he was once the highest-ranking openly gay person in the Clinton White House. He was also helped to organize and participated in the nation's first ever meeting between a sitting president and leaders of the LGBT community. A founder and first board president of the National Black Justice Coalition, Keith has spoken to audiences large and small all across the world. He delivered a landmark speech to 200,000 people at the Millennium March in Washington, D.C., as he gave a stirring speech about the AIDS epidemic in front of 40,000 people in Chicago's Soldier Field in July of 2006. Please welcome Keith Boykin.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, everyone, very much. Thank you for inviting me. I have only 10 minutes to speak, so I'll be brief. Thank you to the University of Maryland, to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, to President Loh, and to PEN America for organizing this important event today. And thank you all for coming out here on Black Panther Day. Yes, it is Black Panther Day, in case you didn't know that. I want to say today that I'm coming here today from a perspective where I understand the conflict between civil rights and civil liberties, the tension that exists that sometimes we often see or we talk about. My background is as an activist. I started Harvard Law School as an activist, fighting for diversity and inclusion. And my first incident was standing outside a faculty meeting advocating for diversity, holding up a sign in protest when the faculty members walked by and the dean of the law school walked by, and I called out to the dean to come back and talk to us, and he didn't do it. So I ran after him, and the dean of the Harvard Law School literally began sprinting across the campus to run away from me. So I sprinted across the campus to catch up with him, and the photo of me chasing the dean of the law school appeared in the front page of the Metro section of the Boston Globe the following day. So that began my career in activism. And since that time, I have worked on other issues, taught civil rights, civil liberties at American University, and served as a general editor of the Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Journal at Harvard as well when I was a student there. But I only have 10 minutes, as I said, so I thought what I would do is I would provide sort of 10 ideas, quick ideas, sort of a list of things to consider for today. I didn't want to call them commandments. I thought that might be too megalomaniacal. So I thought I'd call them commandish things, just sort of to think about for today about free speech. 10 things. So here's my list. Number one, first, freedom of speech and civil liberties are currently under attack. I think we all know this. I don't know if I'm supposed to be political or not, but I cannot not be political at this moment when the President of the United States has waged an assault, an all-out assault on freedom of speech, specifically targeting African-American football players in the NFL, simply who choose to take a knee. This is an outrageous, I think, violation not only of his presidential duty, but of what I think is a constitutional imperative not to do such things. And I want to cite just this one case, which I may bring up again later, from 1943 West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court says, and I quote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein." This is in 1943, in the middle of the World War II, that the U.S. Supreme Court was able to say this. And today we are in 2018, and we have a President of the United States who's not willing to abide by these basic norms of constitutional decency. Number two, civil rights are also under attack. Again, I point to the President of the United States, and I point to an attack that is going on not only by him, but by his political party against voting rights, LGBT rights, the rights of Muslims and Mexican immigrants, of undocumented immigrants, of DACA recipients, and the rights of citizens from those non-Nordic shithole countries that the President despises. Number three, the Constitution only guarantees you freedom of speech from government action. This is an important point to consider because private citizens and businesses are not bound by the First Amendment. In fact, one of the things I used to talk about when I taught employment discrimination was that most employers, and most employees rather, exist in sort of an employment at will relationship with their employers. So the employer, your employer, in most situations, unless you have a contract, you work for the government, can fire you at any time for any reason, unless it's one of those specifically prohibited reasons in the Constitution or in federal or state law. So most employees have very few rights, and the point behind this is that the Constitution does not necessarily protect your freedom of speech when it comes to private actions from private citizens and private employers. Number four, colleges and universities are not bound by the Constitution to allow freedom of speech. However, universities exist as a place of learning, and they should try as much as possible to encourage and permit freedom of speech. Number five, institutions of higher education should also promote facts and truth, and they have an obligation to speak clearly and forcefully against false information. We live in an era of alternative facts, where people were in denial of climate change and science, and even basic mathematics. It's imperative for the institution, for institutional actors to stand up and speak out against false information, to speak out against alternative facts, to speak out against what we know to be untrue. Number 6, colleges also have a similar duty to protect their students, not from unpopular ideas, but from hateful actions, and to create a diverse, inclusive, and welcoming environment. Now here I think it's important to point out what I think is a distinction that should be made between personal attacks and a space for freedom of speech from in other spaces on campus. So if someone were to say, to use the N-word or to call someone an inappropriate word, a slanderous word, I don't think that that should be allowed on the college campus personally, because I think that there's a code of conduct that should prohibit that type of behavior. But if someone wants to come and speak on a campus and to say things that are also hateful and offensive, I think that's a different issue. And I think that's an issue where the colleges have more of an obligation to open up and create a space for people to be able to, even controversial speakers, to be able to come and express their viewpoint. Which leads me to point number 7. Freedom of speech applies to unpopular speech. The example I remember from my childhood was the idea of the Nazis marching in the predominantly Jewish community in Skokie, Illinois. I also saw in my lifetime, I watched a KKK rally, a Ku Klux Klan rally in Atlanta, Georgia, as they marched through the streets, and I was among the many people who were out there protesting against them. And it wasn't a very welcoming experience for the Ku Klux Klan members who were there when they were surrounded by hundreds of protesters who outnumbered the few people who were there to support the Klan and their white supremacist views. Here again, I'd like to briefly quote from the West Virginia Board of Education decision I mentioned before, where Justice Robert Jackson writes, "Freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to the things that touch the heart of the existing order." So you cannot really have true free speech if you only allow freedom of speech about things that everyone agrees about. Freedom of speech requires us to allow the freedom about those things where we do not agree, and about those things that are essentially very troubling for us and touch the core of who we are as a people. You have the right to burn the flag. You have the right to protest the flag. You have the right not to stand up for the flag. Those things, even though they may be offensive to other people, to some people, they're also part of the core of what makes our country special and what makes the flag important in the first place. Number 8, freedom of speech does not mean, and this is important, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences of your action. You may have the right to say things that are unpopular or hateful or offensive, but that does not mean that I do not also have the right to challenge you, to contrast you, to speak up against you as forcefully as I can, to demand that you be denounced for your words. Number 9, freedom of speech is not absolute. We think of the First Amendment and the constitutional right to freedom of speech, but there are some exceptions. And one of those exceptions we know, for example, is libel. You can't write things that are not true and defamatory. Another is slander. You can't say things about someone that's not true or defamatory. You can't reveal classified information that the government has access to just because you have access to. And the government even has limitations in when it can and cannot choose to restrain prior restraint against journalists and newspapers and other media outlets to try to provide information. So there are limitations on what you can and cannot do in the context of freedom of speech, and that right is not absolute. Which leads me, finally, I hope I made this in 10 minutes, to the 10th commandish type of thing, and that is that freedom of speech is difficult. It's something that we've been wrestling with as a country for hundreds of years. I suspect as long as we have this in the First Amendment to our Constitution, we will continue to wrestle with this issue. As a society, we have to make tough choices. But I fear that once we as a society decide to restrict certain types of speech, the question then is who decides? Who gets to decide what type of speech is acceptable and what type of speech is not acceptable? Certainly, as a liberal, progressive Democrat myself, I have no problem or fewer problems with, actually I do have a problem with anyone making those decisions in government. But I suspect I'd probably agree more with President Barack Obama than with the President Donald Trump. And I don't like the idea of giving those powers to any president, because that president may change, the party may change, the views may change. I like the idea that we as a country accept the reality that even though the views may change, our society is built on freedom, and no freedom is more important than the freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith, for a rousing and comprehensive opening to our conversation. My name is Suzanne Nossel. I'm the Executive Director of PEN America, and I'm delighted to be here. PEN America has worked extensively on the issue of campus free speech. Over the last couple of years, we issued a report in late 2016 entitled Diversity, Inclusion, and Freedom of Speech at U.S. Universities, and our aim has been to try to bridge the tension between the imperative that the campus become a more inclusive, equal, and diverse environment, and also the necessity to preserve robust protections for free speech and academic freedom. We believe ardently that those two missions of the university can and must be reconciled, and we've been working at a series of campuses around the country. We were at Berkeley in January, and then, in November, at Middlebury in January, here at Maryland, and then we'll be at the University of Virginia next month in dialogue. And we were in a full day of a closed-door symposium with students, faculty, and administrators, and I can tell you it was eye-opening to learn about the challenges here at the University of Maryland and to hear from so many impassioned students, professors, and administrators about what the struggles are, the reality here on campus, and I'm looking forward to exploring those issues, but also widening the lens and having a broader discussion on free expression with our distinguished panel. I want to quickly introduce those we have with us tonight, apart from Keith. So on my right is Nadine Strawson, and it's hard to imagine a better person for a panel on freedom of speech. She's the John Marshall Harlan Professor of Law at New York Law School and has written, taught, and advocated extensively on these issues over many years. From 1991 through to 2008, she was president of the ACLU, the first woman to head that organization, and she has a new book coming out called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. On my left, welcome Nadine. On my left is Nana Brantuo, who holds a master's degree in African Studies from Howard University and a master's in Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Maryland here. She's currently a doctoral student in minority and urban education here, with interests focused on mobility, migration, and the experiences of African and African descendant peoples. And her work has taken her all over the world. Welcome, Nana. And then finally, Professor Adam Rothman, who's in the history department at Georgetown University. He's an expert in the history of the United States from the Revolution through to the Civil War and the history of slavery and abolition. He was a member of Georgetown's Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation, and is the principal curator of the Georgetown Slavery Archive. Welcome, Adam. All right, so Nana, as the University of Maryland representative up here on this panel, I'm going to ask you to just share a little bit with us why free speech. Keith gave this kind of rousing explanation of how important these freedoms are, and yet they've been in contention and in tension here on campus. There are questions about whether various forms of offensive speech really ought to be protected. Tell us a little bit about how free speech you think is looked at right now by students here at Maryland.
So first of all, thank you. Thank you to everybody that came out tonight. With regard to our campus and our conversations around free speech, so we're not ultimately having conversations. I think what happens, there's an incident on campus, and there's several that happen every semester. Students, in particular students who come from marginalized or are part of marginalized communities, will raise attention to what they are often sometimes civil rights violations, and ultimately it feels like we're shut down in conversation, especially with regard to administration. And I think that really speaks to a larger legacy at the University of Maryland of not speaking up to and acknowledging a lot of things that are associated with our university's history. Whether it has to do with the fact that this is indigenous land, right? We have several buildings, we have a Susquehanna Hall, for instance, but there's never a formal acknowledgement of the peoples that occupied this space, who were of this space, until they were ultimately pushed out, killed. We don't talk about the enslaved people that helped build parts of this campus as well. We don't talk about being in a southern state and how that informs a lot of the perspectives that students bring here. We may be in Prince George's County, which is very ethnically and racially diverse, maybe fall around the lines of like Democratic Party in terms of voting, but we have a lot of folks who do come here from other parts of Maryland who are very conservative, some of them who are point blank racist. And I think one of the issues here on our campus is that we don't want to own that. We don't want to talk about those kind of things. We just want to sort of fall behind rhetoric of we are a community, almost like a beloved community, and that's just not what this place is, and it's never been. And I think to move forward and build community, it is important to start from a space of honesty and also acknowledging the fact, just like what Keith said, like free speech is complicated, it's complex. I think a lot of people, or I don't think a lot of people even understand the overall legality of the First Amendment, but I think for a lot of us there is this understanding of realities of how race, ethnicity, religion, all of these things operate within our larger society and the university, which is a microcosm of the society, right? There are ways in which I feel, as a Black woman, my right to freedom of speech, to exercise such, would not be as respected as those of my peers, and I feel like there are a lot of us who have experienced that on this campus.
Can you give an example of that?
I feel like, what's a good example? Because I mean, there are so many things that have happened on campus. I would say, okay, perfect example, the time in which, and this might not be the best example, but there was a day in which we were having a conference on campus where people were coming to talk about social justice, and there were students whom we presume to be white conservative, were chalking on the sidewalk, saying things like build the wall, all these different things about Trump, which is they have their right to do that. But in terms of what are the ramifications of that? What happens with that? Why are these things allowed? Why, when students ask questions about these kind of incidents, why would we ask about why whomever hangs a noose wherever on this campus, which that's been a problem for a long time, that it seems like we can't even get any transparency. Like we can't get, or we don't have that feeling of the transparency is there. Or if somebody did violate something, where is the reconciliation sort of process on this campus? I think that's what feeds into this feeling of, oh, well, I'm queer, or I'm Muslim, or I'm a Black student, and I don't feel like anything I say is valued. Time and time again, we have a task force, we have a committee, and nothing comes of it.
Sorry, that's for you. Nadine, I'm going to turn to you about this question of what are the boundaries of free speech? And this is a public university, so it is considered part of the state. When if speech were punished or banned here, that would be state action. You know, and yet there are some forms of speech, harassment, threats that are out of bounds. Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. I don't have to speak directly into this, do I?
I think
Can folks hear me? Well, maybe I'll
yes,
in
I think
favor of.
you do actually. Thank
Okay.
you.
So I was, actually, I, like Keith, have studied and taught First Amendment free speech law for a long time. But in the process of writing my book, I have to say, I was really surprised at the extent to which so much of what we loosely call hate speech is actually punishable consistent with First Amendment principles. I put that term hate speech in quotation marks because it is not a legal term of art. The courts have never recognized a category of speech determined by its hateful content that is therefore unprotected. The way it has said obscenity, certain sexual content, is unprotected. And we usually use the term hate speech to mean hateful, discriminatory, disparaging on the basis of certain personal characteristics. But it is true, so let me make one basic point that summarizes what I've said so far. One essential First Amendment principle is what we lawyers call viewpoint neutrality. Government, including the University of Maryland, which is a government entity, may never restrict speech merely because its viewpoint or message is abhorrent, even deeply abhorrent to even the vast majority of us. But the complementary principle is what I call the emergency principle. It's often been called the clear and present danger principle, that government may restrict speech and should do so when the speech directly causes imminent, serious harm. And the Supreme Court has come up with a number of specific categories of speech that satisfy the emergency principle. And when I read about horrific examples of hateful speech on this campus and others, including nooses, I would say that those satisfy one, or many of those satisfy one or more of the emergency principle categories. Sadly, the most pertinent one here would be true threat, when when the speaker means to instill a reasonable fear that you are going to be subject to violence or attack because of your race, religion, ethnicity, or so forth. Noose incidents certainly do satisfy that, given the history behind that abhorrent symbol and the likelihood that it was intended to instill and does instill fear on the part of certain members of the campus community. Another example, which Suzanne referred to, is harassment. I saw in one of the comments that you passed out that one student said, how come sexual harassment is not protected, but racial harassment is protected? No, harassment of any sort, including racial or religious and sexual orientation, any kind of harassment is not protected, and there the definition is if there, you have to look at the context, right, not just the content, but if it's directly targeted to a particular individual or identifiable group of individuals, if it's repeated, if it's severe, if it's pervasive, if it meaningfully interferes with somebody's freedom of movement or sense of freedom, that can be punished. And I could give other examples. Sadly, since you had that terrible murder here on this campus, I have to mention hate crime. Now, hate crime is a legal term of art, sometimes called bias crime. The law in almost every state, including this one, and the federal law, has said that if something is already a crime, such as an assault or a murder or vandalism, then it can be treated as a more serious, more heinous crime if the victim is selected due to discrimination, because that, in recognition that that poses a more serious harm both to the individual victim and to society as a whole. So, and often hate speech is evidence of the discriminatory motive, so the speech is indirectly punished as part of a hate crime.
And I think that's the case with respect to the murder here, that it is being punished as a hate crime, part because of speech online by the murderer. But I want to come back to a point you made about the clear and present danger test. And I think of cross-burning is one example of speech that has been held to be sufficiently threatening that it is not protected under the First Amendment. But thinking about campus, and you said the noose, clearly, I don't know if you consider that an act of speech exactly. I'm curious if you do, if it's a noose hanging in a tree, is that an act of speech? But then things like, say, chalking, end DACA. I mean, that could be something that's very threatening to a student who is here, who is undocumented, who could face deportation if that were to come to pass. Would that meet the test?
I don't think so. I do think that hanging a noose is expressive conduct, just the way burning a cross is. There's no doubt that somebody who engages in that kind of expression is intending to convey a message. And the end DACA, so now this is very interesting, Suzanne. The law uses the term genuine threat or true threat to distinguish something that would be punishable from the way we use threatening more loosely in everyday speech. So there's no doubt that a lot of what President Trump says I find threatening to civil liberties, but I would not consider it punishable as a true threat. Much as I would disagree with that chalked message, and much as it may make particular people feel imperiled of being deported, that would not satisfy the test of true threat, and I don't think it should. But I don't want to end, Suzanne, only by talking about what speech can be punished and what cannot. I mean, the title of my book was very deliberately chosen so that the first word and the first verb is resist. So hate, why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. The fact that something can or cannot be censored is really beside the point, or in addition to the main point that we always can find ways to resist messages that we hate, ideas that we disagree with. So I would say definitely engage with that message, but don't suppress it.
All right, I want to come back to that point, but I want to bring you into the conversation, Adam, our historian. So the First Amendment is well over 200 years old. Do you think it deals adequately with some of the challenges that we face now in a more diverse society? When the First Amendment was written, government meant presidents, legislatures, and courts. It didn't mean an institution like the University of Maryland, where it's a community, it's a place of residence for students, it's serving all this wide breadth of functions that I don't know if they were anticipated in the First Amendment. Should a university have more leeway to regulate speech because of that multiplicity of roles that it plays for students and others on campus?
Suzanne, thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure. I don't have a very good answer to that question about the First Amendment, but I think that in some ways we may focus too much on the First Amendment, on the legal issues around free speech. And I think there may be other ways informed by history of understanding the challenges around free speech. The United States has always been diverse, but that diversity has been premised on inequality, especially racial inequality, for a very long time. We're here on the Maryland campus, and on your campus, you have a statue of Frederick Douglass, an icon, a son of Maryland, and a fighter for freedom and justice. And I was told just recently that Governor Hogan declared this year the year of Frederick Douglass. So I would actually rather talk about Douglass than the First Amendment. And I think there's an instructive episode from Douglass's career that can help us understand the significance and the challenges of freedom of speech. In 1860, after the hanging of John Brown for his raid on Harper's Ferry, Douglass was part of a group, an interracial group of radical abolitionists in Boston who staged a memorial service for John Brown, honoring Brown and commemorating him. That was held at the Tremont Temple, one of the great venues for oratory in Boston. Well, as the gathering was getting underway, a group of anti-abolitionist Bostonians who had planted themselves in the audience began to disrupt the occasion. And they prevented Douglass and his fellow abolitionists from speaking. and they violently broke up the meeting. I mean, there were reports of Douglas, fighting, physically fighting with these protagonists. And the meeting did not happen. But the abolitionists reorganized themselves and carried on. And Douglas himself, in the wake of that occasion, gave a very memorable speech called A Plea for Freedom of Speech. And I just want to read you, if I can, just a very brief quotation from that. Because Douglas is really very instructive on everything. I would say WWFDD. What would Frederick Douglass do? I don't know what he would say if he was here. I can only tell you what he did say in 1860. He said, to suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the right of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak and hear as it would be to rob him of his money. I have no doubt that Boston will vindicate this right. So that's sort of a classic defense of the freedom of speech. But Douglas didn't stop there. He never stopped there. This is what else he said. He said, but in order to do so, there must be no concessions to the enemy. When a man is allowed to speak because he is rich and powerful, it aggravates the crime of denying the right to the poor and humble. So the lesson from Douglas is that it's not enough to defend the freedom of speech as an abstract principle. Douglas also recognized that there was a social context to the freedom of speech, that some people, by virtue of wealth and power, had a greater ability to exercise their freedom of speech than others. And Douglas thought that was unfair. So it's not enough to fight for the freedom of speech. One must also fight for the principle of equality in the freedom of speech. Who gets to speak freely is a really important question. So I would say if we step away a little bit from the First Amendment and look at some of the substantive issues around the question of speech, I think it's extremely important, on the one hand, to defend and exercise the right of the freedom of speech, especially for people who have traditionally and historically been denied that right, as many people have, especially people of color in this country. So that's the first thing. The second thing, if we follow Douglas's example, is we should not just defend and exercise the right of freedom of speech. We must organize interracial, anti-racist politics with our freedom of speech. And then finally, I think we should be thoughtful about the way we do this. Douglas was just incredibly thoughtful. He was erudite, he was learned, his rhetoric was magical, and I think we should emulate him.
Nana.
So, first of all, thank you for that. 1860, 2018, right? And in it, you also bring up a part about interracial sort of coalition and solidarity building. And this is Nana speaking as a black woman that lives in the United States as a daughter of immigrants. I'm tired. I think a lot of us are tired. And I want to learn more then, if we're saying, and we're defending we're acknowledging the complexity of freedom of speech. We're acknowledging how useful it's been in past movements to secure the rights of marginalized people. But I want to know more so of what people in the majority, folks like yourself, right, a white man, what is the work that you all do with your own when it comes to those who project, in particular, hate speech? Because whether or not we want to look at it like this or not, especially me, in my big, dark, black body, most white people are not hearing me. They're not listening to me. And I will still continue to counter what they say, but I need to know more about the solid steps of what allies or co-conspirators are doing in this work, because it is tiresome. It is tiresome, the fights in particular that African Americans have taken on for centuries in this nation. My God. Sometimes I don't even, I don't even know how we get to this point or how we've gotten to this point when we do talk about freedom of speech. There's almost this want for people of color to unyieldingly support an amendment that when it was written, when it was adopted, we weren't even considered to be citizens. We weren't human beings. And I don't like when people don't put the historical context to that. It's only decades later that indigenous people were now considered citizens. Right? We're talking about, we're functioning within an amendment that was written that didn't even consider us. We're functioning within institutions that had no intention of admitting us and still actively in a lot of their policies, practices, and protocols tell us, we don't want you. So I just need to know more about the work that's being done because there's something that has been happening, because I also don't want us to get onto this like, oh, this has come out of nowhere. No, white America has been like this for a long time, since white America began. Because white supremacy is a real thing. What is the work that's being done by the majority to address hate speech? Because I also want us to acknowledge the fact that hate speech, in a lot of times throughout history, we've seen hate speech evolve into hate violence. We've seen that in this nation, we've seen that in Europe, we saw that in Bosnia, we saw that in Germany, we saw that in Rwanda. Like, what is the work that's being done? Because if you continue to ask me, or people like me, minoritized and marginalized people, to hold the brunt of the labor, and we've been doing that for so long, dying because of that, like, what are the solid steps? And it could be applied to institutional space as well, right? Because, okay, if we're gonna talk about dialogue, what does that look like? And are we really about it? Are we really committed to it? Because I'm tired.
Yeah, this is a comment. It's not the first time I've heard a student of color who has said the equivalent of the First Amendment wasn't written for me, and it has to do with how black people were looked at the time the amendment was enacted, but I think also the experience that the First Amendment tends to be invoked to protect offensive speech. And when you see it only invoked that way, it can be alienating. And I'm curious, Keith, how you look at this, this question of how we broaden we rely a lot on counter speech. I mean, our response to a lot of offensive and problematic speech is, well, more speech. And one of the points Donna has made is, that puts a heavy onus oftentimes on certain people to be, the voice of that speech, to articulate their positions. They often do so from a stance of some vulnerability. I'm wondering, how you see this, whether you think more can be done to try to level this playing field. Do you see it as skewed as Nana does?
You had to ask me this hard question. No, I agree with almost everything Nana said. I understand the frustration. I totally get that. And yet, I'm not sure what the alternative is. It reminds me of the old quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill, that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. Yes, this is true that I believe that the Constitution wasn't written for black people. It's very clear. The First Amendment, the Second Amendment, none of the amendments until the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th had anything to do with the concern for African Americans. And even those have at times been turned against us. And yet we know that, and we live in a society where it is a white supremacist society. It's a racist, sexist, classist, misogynist, homophobic, heterosexist, culturally imperialistic society, and we can't do anything to change that unless we acknowledge that. But that still doesn't negate the fact that we live in that society. And at the end of the day, I'm confused because I don't know what else to do. And I don't want to take a cop-out and ask you for the answer to your own question, but I don't trust or expect white people to take on the responsibility to lead us to the promised land. I feel that we as African Americans have to do that for ourselves. And because of that, I don't even want to bother to ask them to take on that duty as much as I think they should take on the responsibility of educating one another. I don't expect that. Historically, I have to speak about this from a political perspective as a political person, as a Democrat. Ever since Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, no Democratic president has ever won the majority of the white vote. None. Not Jimmy Carter, who was from the South, not Bill Clinton from the South, definitely not Barack Obama. No Democratic president has ever won the majority of the white vote since since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Clearly, white people are a racist community. It doesn't mean every white person is racist, but the white society is racist. And black people have been saying this for a long time, and until black people started getting killed and black people started being objectified, nobody really paid attention. So what do we do about it? And that's where I don't really have an answer for you, and I feel sad about that. But I think that the framers of the Constitution, with some exceptions, created a structure that, even though it wasn't intended to include us, actually could serve us well. And that's where I feel that, maybe Nadine has something to add to this, but I feel that we can, Audre Lorde is famous for saying the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. I believe that. Maybe we can create our own, but at this point, I don't know how we do that in the structure of the society. And so I'm looking for an answer to that question, and I'm sorry that's not an answer, but that's my question as well.
So Nadine, I want to turn to you and just pose this question. I mean, you've written about what can be done to address the problem of hate speech short of censorship. And I think it's an urgent question. I mean, we see a spike in white supremacist activity on campus. I think that a lot of the taboos that operated, that kept certain words and ideas kind of out of bounds or maybe just over the horizon in our society have now been invited into the mainstream. What are the tactics and tools you see as most effective, and do you really think they're powerful and potent enough to counter what we're seeing in society right now?
Sort of taking up from Keith's point, they're far more effective than censorship. Trying to suppress hate speech never works, except to redound to the benefit of the hateful speaker. A year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, when I was writing my book. And
can I ask a question? I don't want to interrupt you, but
please.
I just want to ask, you said trying to suppress hateful speech. I just want to know, how does it work in Germany? Because I know in Germany they do that, and I was there last summer, and it seems to be a whole different society.
It's terrible. And human rights activists and minority rights activists in Germany are not supportive of those laws because they have Germany has, understandably because of its history, some of the strictest hate speech laws in the world. And yet their episodes of racist violence have exploded. So, I mean, correlation does not prove causation, but clearly the hate speech laws have not eliminated discrimination and violence. And we think that Trump and his racist policies are bad. Look at the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, which is an expressly racist party, got 13% of the vote in the last election, and in some parts of the country, 30% of the vote. So, and many people are surprised. And let me say, speaking of Germany, I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. If not the Nazis had had their way, I wouldn't have existed. My father was scheduled to be, he was in a concentration camp. He was scheduled to be sterilized one day after he was liberated by American soldiers. So I absolutely loathe fascism and hate groups of any sort. And I will quote the executive director of the ACLU during the famous Skokie case, who himself was a Holocaust survivor, Aryeh Neier. He said, "I loathe the Nazis even more than I love free speech." So if I thought that barring their speech would suppress their ideas, I would be all in favor of it. And I say, hear, hear. But let me give an example very close to home. About a year ago, as I was writing my book, I knew who Milo Yiannopoulos was, but about a year ago, almost nobody knew who he was. When did he become so prominent and on everybody's radar screen? When Berkeley tried to shut him down. And the same thing happened with the Nazis in Germany, not to mention the Nazis in Skokie. They would have been, here and there in a blink of the eye, except the attempt to shut them down led to worldwide publicity. And this is what hate mongers seek, that attention. So I think the best, I've got many ideas myself, but I think the expertise on countering hateful actions and ideas lies very largely with the Southern Poverty Law Center. They've done terrific work on it for many, many decades. And this summer, they put out a handbook for college students, campus communities, given the frightening recruitment efforts of white supremacists on campus. And interestingly enough, the point that they stress is that it will feel morally satisfying, but please do not confront them. Please do not try to shut them down. Please do not try to shout them down, because that gives them the platform that they are seeking. So please resist that. By all means, try to persuade the students who are inviting them to not invite them, to withdraw the invitation. Have your own event somewhere far away that's affirmative, that is celebrating diversity and inclusivity, but try to ignore them. In Germany, Keith, one of the things that anti-Nazis do is to make fun of so Nazis still exist in Germany despite these hate speech laws. And one example that I saw that I thought was worthy of imitation. There's this group of Nazis that every year in this small town in Germany march to the grave of one of the Nazi leaders in sort of for them it's like a pilgrimage. And the people in the town have turned it into an involuntary walkathon. So for every inch these people march, they're involuntarily, members of the town have contributed to a fund that goes to organizations that recruit people away from fascist groups. I just want to say one thing in response to Nana's understandable and eloquent statement, which is I also was not included in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, and yet I think that we would not have had abolition of slavery. We would not have had the civil rights movement. We would not have had the women's rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, any other progressive movement if it had not been for freedom of speech. And that's why not only Frederick Douglass, but Martin Luther King and all of the other activists for racial justice have also been very strong activists in support of robust free speech.
I mean, Nana, I have a question. How do you respond to this idea that as flawed as it is, our current system, that we would be worse off under any other, and that we wouldn't have had, as Jean just said, the progress we've had on civil rights and various other fronts, if people didn't have the full protections for freedom of association, freedom to protest, freedom of speech that we have. Is that persuasive to you, or can you envision sort of a different set of rules or some adjustment in the rules that you think might yield a more even playing field or a better result?
Well, I just feel, and pardon me, because I'm processing a lot of this, and I'm also processing a lot of emotions and feelings because I am human, and it is just so fascinating coming to this conversation because I just feel like Black folks' rights have never been fully respected in this place and in this country anyway. So like, there's no movement, there's no action that in particular Black, and I'm focusing on Black folks, but I could also talk about indigenous peoples as well. There's no action that we've taken that we don't understand, like this could mean your life, right? For instance, Sitting Bull and his resistance to the United States, that meant his life. For MLK, that meant his life, especially when he started then talking about class emancipation alongside racial emancipation, right? This is such a complex conversation. And God help me, I'm just over the onus of all of this being on the marginalized groups. And while, yes, I understand, like, when we're talking about a lot of these laws that were written, and there are ways in which you weren't written to them either, I think it's very interesting when someone like me, a Black woman, comes into this space, and we're talking about racism, sexism, all mixtures of things and how they impact us on a daily basis. I think it's interesting when we talk about the institution or higher education institutions. So we're asking Black students who just got let into these universities yesterday to take on the bulk of this labor as well and have to deal with harassment like that they have to deal with on a daily basis anyway. I'm imagining a world where you can be, especially a young black woman, and you don't have to think about coming on campus and dealing with microaggressions. You don't have to figure out what's the best way to organize to get your university administration to hear you around how speech is hateful and makes you feel afraid to go to even your classes, right? I'm imagining, I don't know how we get to that space. I could be honest about that. But I can be honest in saying that I'm fed up. I'm fed up of students coming into the office where I work at, exasperated, tired, don't know where to turn, don't know who to go to. And when they reach out, they know who to reach out to, though. The black woman in the office who tends to have the lowest power in the institution. And then she has to do her work on top of that while making sure to take care of these students that know that they're at a space that does not value them. I don't know what this looks like. I don't think any of us know exactly what this looks like, but I know there needs to be change, and in particular, and I understand, I'm not saying I rely on white folk to do anything for me, because I don't. But I do think that we are in a point and in a time in our history where it's like, well, you say you're an ally, you say you're a co-conspirator, show me. What does that look like? Because I'm tired of going to trainings where we talk about free speech or we talk about engagement, and it's led by people of color or queer folk, and they have to deal with microaggressions. They have to deal with people not wanting to be there. They have to deal with hateful comments in, the evaluations. Like, all of this labor, especially at this university, is on us. Now, how do we get to a point where that's more equitable? And then the labor is on us, and then it's fascinating too, because then you'll look at this university in terms of numbers, especially people who are kept here in terms of tenure. And for black women who are professors on this campus who gain this tenure status, it's pitiful. And it's shameful. But they still take on all this work. We take on all of this work historically. I'm just frustrated. I don't have the answer.
Can I just make a quick response to that?
Sure.
I think that in listening to you, I'm thinking maybe part of the solution, at least from what I'm hearing from my perspective, is that we don't continue to expect anything from these institutions, and instead we support our own institutions. Historically black colleges, universities, black organizations, black social organizations. I'm a student of the former professor Derek Bell, who believed and wrote about the permanence of racism, and I believe that as well. I don't think that white society is ever going to change, not as long as white people are the majority, even though that's supposedly going to change in 2044. But I don't think that's going to change even then. The racism that is endemic as a part of our society, is part of the founding principle of who we are. So why waste our time trying to do that? And I think anytime you choose to go to a white institution or be engaged in a white institution, which in many instances you kind of have no choice about, you are in some ways compelled to do that work, as frustrating as it is. And that the only way to avoid that is to support and engage and be a part of black institutions instead.
One point, Adam, that came up today during our daytime conversation was around the history of the university and the fact that these were originally indigenous lands, that some of the buildings on campus, I understand, were built with slave labor, and that all of this history hasn't yet been fully reckoned with. And you were part of a process of Georgetown of doing that work of reckoning and reconciliation. And I'm wondering whether you think that made a difference. Was there a sense that doing that work collectively at the university could help advance some of the tensions that are being talked about in this conversation?
Yeah, I was part of the Georgetown's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, and I've been working for the last couple of years to go through the universities and other archives to explore and publicize the history of the university with respect to its involvement in the slave economy. And I think that's been a shocking revelation for a lot of people, and for some anyway, not everybody. Some people ignore it or deny its significance. For some people, it has opened their eyes to the historical entanglement of higher education and systems of oppression. which should never have been a mystery or a secret or a surprise. But for some reason now the excavation of these histories has, I think, shed some new light on it. Maryland actually has undergone, at least there are people at Maryland who have investigated the university's history. My mentor, one of my mentors, Ira Berlin, the great historian of slavery who teaches here, he actually did a report with some of his undergraduate students, I think about 10 years ago, about the university's roots in the slave economy of Maryland. Now, that work was done. I don't know how widely known the report is. I don't know if it's taught or discussed or publicized. It should be, though, because that's important history.
What did you say?
What'd you say? No, go ahead.
No, I was saying, like, no, you're making a good point, and then I want those folks who are a part of administration to also hear that as well. Like, we do have the materials, we do have the people here that do the work, like you were mentioning, Ira Berlin, and he's done excellent work. Like, we do have resources on this campus as well that I feel like we should definitely tap into, and not just like higher level administration or faculty, but we have excellent, phenomenal students on this campus that do excellent work around gender, ability, class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, all of these different things. And I feel like that's something that we should definitely do more work in terms of tapping into that knowledge bank and really utilizing it, not like putting together a list of recommendations and then it's all for naught because nothing happens or happens with it.
Okay, we're going to open up to questions from the audience, and I think there is, no, the mic is all the way back there and all the way back there. Okay, so that's, instead of coming to the front, I guess you walk to the back and ask your question. I don't know if we can bring them up, which might be a little more natural, but if not, if anybody would like to ask a question of our panel, you can go to the mic and start in. And while you're thinking about what your question is, I'm going to ask you to come back to something you brought up, Nadine. You know, you've argued strenuously that banning hate speech doesn't help abate violence or any linkage between hate speech and hate crimes, but I'm wondering whether you do see that linkage. I mean, here at Maryland, it feels like a fairly vivid example where there was a rise in white supremacist leafleting, and that presence on campus, that messaging on campus. There was an individual who became involved in online groups that were engaged in that kind of propaganda, and then a capital crime took place, a murder took place. Do you think that had more been done to perhaps address that leafleting, the early emergence of white supremacist ideology on campus, that trajectory could have taken a different course? Or what's your view on that linkage?
Well, any individual crime is impossible to predict, as we're seeing even today with the school shooting. But believe me, I am the first one to want to suppress hateful attitudes and hateful actions. I think that going after speech is just a superficial, quick fix that does not work now. It has not worked in the past. Going back to the poignant example of Germany, many people are surprised to learn that in Weimar Germany, as the Nazis were rising to power, Germany had essentially the very same laws that it continues to have today. And there were many, many prosecutions under it, including of leading Nazis. And the leading Jewish organizations at the time said that these laws are being enforced fairly. Most of the prosecutions were handled well. So it wasn't as if the law was just ignored, but the Nazis used it as a propaganda platform. Now, what was marketed there and also marketed in certain points of the civil rights movement in this country was not the failure to suppress hate speech, but the failure to punish hateful violence. So the Nazis were getting away with murder, literally. They were murdering their political foes and murdering Jews and other minorities, and the government did not punish them. We had that failure of the law to a certain extent in this country as well during the civil rights movement, when local and state officials at best were ineffective in prosecuting violence against civil rights demonstrators, at worst complicit in it. The federal government did ultimately step in, but the analogy would have been as if there had been no prosecution of the murderers of Dr. King or Medgar Evers.
Okay, question here, please.
Hello, my name is Leticia. I'm a PhD student here at University of Maryland, and I have a question. It's fairly simple. Knowing how white supremacy is tied up in the construction of the United States, I'm curious, when can we hold white people accountable for the creation,
Can you step just a tiny bit away from the
with the
mic?
creation of white supremacy and the effects on people of color and those in marginalized positions? And when is it appropriate for us to talk about that and to have frank conversations about it?
So a question about whether and when white people will be held accountable for the history of white supremacy
And how it impacts the current day, yeah.
and its implications today. The historian?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what you mean by held accountable. If it means prosecuting the historical crimes of white supremacy in American courts of justice, that's not going to happen. You're appealing to the same institutions that allowed it and perpetrated it in the first place. But if you're talking about kind of moral accountability, talking about it, having conversations about it, exposing the crimes of white supremacy, we're having that conversation now. And there are places you can have that conversation. You can probably have that conversation in a lot of your history classes here at the University of Maryland. You probably can.
I would also say that that conversation is not a historical conversation so much as it is a present-day conversation, considering we have a white supremacist president who was elected by white supremacist people who voted for him, or people who had no problem with white supremacy at least. And I don't think that there's ever a time not to hold people accountable for the privilege that they continue to enjoy that was perpetuated by a corrupt system. I was reading in a book recently that in 1860, a book called White Rage, by the way, in 1860, and I just forgot the number, I think it was 80% of America's gross domestic product was tied to slavery. Would suggest to me that America would be a backwater country were it not for the presence of black slaves, indigenous people, and other people who built this country, and yet we still do not reap the benefits. Donald Trump was taking credit for the drop in unemployment in the black community recently, which had nothing to do with him, and the drop was to 6.8%. Which was still twice the rate of the white community. If the white community had a 6.8% unemployment rate, do you think Donald Trump would be bragging about that? Why is it acceptable for black people to have double the unemployment rate that white people do? Why is it acceptable that we have twice the infection rates for HIV/AIDS? Why is it acceptable that we have 1/100th of a percentage of the wealth that white Americans have? Why is it acceptable that a black person with a college degree has fewer economic opportunities and career opportunities than the white person without a high school degree? And yet we accept this as a norm because that's just the way things are. If you want to hold people accountable for white supremacy, it's not about what happened just in 1863, 1864, and 1865. It's about what's happening today.
And I think that's about politics. That's about organizing politically to form a coalition that can confront white supremacy. So how do you do that?
All right, I want to go to.
I agree, and I think white people need to take the onus in that as well. Like black people have been saying this for a long time.
But I say they're not going to.
And I hear that,
say,
and I understand that.
Why do we keep expecting white people to do something they're not going to do?
Didn't you just say that we should hold them accountable,
I said
though?
yes. I said we're
Why
gonna
should the
hold-
onus of that be on us?
But I said we should hold them accountable in the sense that we should, yes, call them out, tell them, but you're going to be continually frustrated if you think that white people are going to suddenly change. Frederick Douglass, who we quoted before, said, Power concedes nothing without a struggle. That doesn't mean we have to sit back and say how frustrated we are and do nothing. And yes, it's frustrating. Yes, it's not fair. But we have to be engaged in the fight. We can't not be engaged in the fight.
We've been engaged in the fight for centuries.
No, I understand that. I understand you. Maybe we're saying the same thing. I'm not sure.
I don't know.
I just feel like it's not going to change, and I don't feel like that we have any other obligation other than to ourselves. That's the point I wanted to make.
Okay, please.
Okay,
Nisha.
I stepped into that. I'm a person who likes to talk about concrete things, so I assume the white people in this space are allies or people who want to at least engage in this dialogue, and I think it's very difficult when you talk about systems of racial oppression, institutionalized racism. I think it's very difficult to get that down into bite-sized, tangible actions that can be taken on the individual level. So I think it would be helpful if everyone wants to answer the question of what can white people do in their own spaces that is tangible and reasonable, that does not negatively impact people of color, people who are non-conforming, genderqueer, what have you, because I think that's what people actually need to hear. How, as a white person, can I resist and not essentially be complicit in a system that is oppressing and exploiting Black and brown and other individuals?
So Nadine, I'm going to turn to you because I know you looked at this question in your book and you mentioned what the Southern Poverty Law Center said not to do in terms of direct confrontation, but what are some of the things, or at least one thing that a white ally can
Well,
do?
so when we're talking about counter speech, and I completely agree with Nana that that should not be the burden or the responsibility of the person who is targeted by the hateful speech. That is the responsibility of every decent person in the community, and certainly of every leader in the community. So if there's a hate speech incident on campus, even if there's an invited speaker who's spewing hateful ideas, I believe that it is the responsibility of the university president and student body president and other community leaders to say, yes, we defend your freedom to speak, but we are exercising our freedom to denounce your ideas. I also think it's especially that there's a moral responsibility on those of us who defend freedom for hate speech to be the ones at the front that are protesting. So very often, so the ACLU from Skokie on, yes, we defended the right of the Nazis to demonstrate, but we had our members out there in force counter-demonstrating. I think that there was a very helpful, and to me, I'm an activist, so I tend to see the glass half full rather than the glass half empty. I have hope that we'll continue incrementally to finally arrive at the aspirations of liberty and justice for all that we were so far away from at the beginning, but still aspiring. After Charlottesville, there was such an outpouring across every sector of society. I mean, with the conspicuous exception of Donald Trump, we had Republican members of Congress and other Republican leaders, as well as Democratic leaders, denouncing the white supremacists. We had military leaders denouncing, to the extent that some people even said, well, the military is supposed to stay separate from civilian government. We had top corporate leaders, CEOs, right? The two corporate groups that were advising the president disbanded. They so disagreed with him and were so strong in denouncing the white supremacy. And at the grassroots level, all around the country, there were spontaneous demonstrations. So I think that there is a moral duty for speaking out, and for education. I mean, I already alluded to this. There are many organizations that focus on educating, deflecting people who are attracted toward white supremacist groups, to recruiting them away. to stopping other people from being recruited into them. And while the internet is very scary in terms of, in one sense, that it's easier for hate speech to spread, it's also easier for counter speech to spread. And there have been very remarkable examples. It takes a lot of patience and a lot of conversations and difficult conversations, but one by one, I believe we can wean away would-be haters.
Okay, I want to get one more question in.
Yeah, I was going to be a filler, so go ahead.
Go ahead.
So good evening, Joseph Rees. I am a member of the Washington, D.C. community. And I've just heard a lot in the short time that I've been here. And I actually kind of wanted to deal with Nadine's points that you have actually brought up as far as like avoiding direct confrontation. So I am a son of Howard University. And on our campus a few years back, Westboro Baptist Church decided that they wanted to visit themselves and their hate upon our campus, and we engaged in direct confrontation. And we engaged in the type of direct confrontation that many people would say is not helpful because it gives them attention and publicity. But we engaged in that direct confrontation because we were not going to stand by and be complicit and let them be psychologically violent to us. As people who were queer and as people who were not queer. So kind of like in this whole kind of like we have to avoid them because or we have to ignore them, or we can't give them attention because if we ignore them and if we don't give them attention, they'll just go away. That has kind of like, that argument has kind of like proven to be null and void by the president that we currently have sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And that kind of argument has proven to be null and void because also particularly as white people and particularly as the white people that are on this panel tonight, right? We kind of like need to stop talking about Trump supporters like they're this fringe off in the corner somewhere because they're not.
I agree.
Because like these Trump supporters are very much so a part of the mainstream. And 53% of them were like white women. And while I want to be clear about the violence that can be visited upon women's bodies across race, I also think like when we're talking about allies, like we kind of like we always kind of like to talk about like the violence of white women, of white men, but we never talk about the violence of white women. But like my question is like, how do we like engage in kind of like this whole discussion of like not engaging in direct confrontation, but while also acknowledging how being silent also kind of like opens people's bodies up to psychic violence.
What did you do when Westboro Baptist
So
came?
like when Westboro Baptist came, like once again, we weren't like, for example, we weren't on the same side of the street as they were. We did not engage in physical contact with them, but we did stand on the side of the on the opposing side of the street, and we did give like opposing kind of like opposing messages.
So you showed up in force, yeah. And that's what you did in school,
Yeah,
that sounds
exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, these are tactical decisions, and I think the SPLC's view was more toward, a much more direct confrontation that would be the kind of violence that we've seen on some campuses that generates news. But definitely you want to protest their messages. You want them to know that you're protesting their messages, and you want the rest of the world to know that as well. It's interesting that you mentioned the Westboro Baptist Church because one of the incidents that I was alluding to involved, it's a whole family. So one of the daughters was online trying to recruit people to join this hateful organization. And two people started engaging with her. She wrote about it in the New Yorker magazine. And they actually got her to quit the organization. Now, people who do that kind of work say that confrontation and protest doesn't work at that level. it works to send a political message. But if you're going to try to recruit somebody one by one away, you have to use empathy and compassion and respect. It may stick in your craw, but that may be the most effective tactic to actually win somebody over as an individual.
I want to get to one last question from Roger.
All right, so I wanted to go ahead and ask my question. I was going to the mic because nobody else was at first, but let me ask my question anyway. So I think we live in this new normal in some ways, where white supremacists, the alt-right, are targeting university campuses. And they're doing it intentionally to provoke and disrupt. And they're using free speech as camouflage for intimidation and harassment and those kinds of things. Those incidents have taken place on our own campus. A couple of examples. One was the chalking that took place, probably students, right? But there was chalking on our campus. There have been flyers up on our campus. And when speech is spoken, it's momentary. I can say an offensive word and it's gone moments later. But when somebody puts chalk down or paint or a flyer, even though it might not damage the property, it lasts indefinitely until it's removed or it's deteriorated into nothingness. The university has some gray area here to deal with. How permanent is free speech? That's a question that I have. When somebody posters, are we not allowed to take those posters down if they're postered in a certain place? If somebody puts chalk down, are we not allowed to step forward and stamp it out or erase it as a university? Because we are an agent of the state. Where are the limits and the obligations there?
Just to elaborate, in one sense, I looked at one of the posters that was put up here at Maryland showing images of white men, women, and children with the words, quote, "Defending your people is a social duty, not an antisocial crime," or "We have a right to exist." So they were not threatening posters. I think for that reason, the university determined that it was not hate speech or threatening language. So not something that could be banned on campus. I think there was a vandalism issue, but
So let's say it was, though. What if it was?
Clearly, the message is clear, even though the language may seem, anodyne on the surface. The language, the image, the import is clear.
It's an idea that I radically disagree with, but I defend it as I defend ideas that are not targeted threats. Now, speech does not have to be permanent in this sense, Roger. The university may enforce content-neutral time, place, and manner regulations. So you could say no chalking allowed here or chalking allowed only for 24 hours, but you may not, or posters not allowed in this place or posters in that place, but they're only going to be up for 1 day or 1 week. But you cannot selectively erase certain messages or take down certain posters because you dislike them. I want to bring us all back to political reality here because I think Keith asked the essential question. If we are going to decide that some chalked messages or some posters are so offensive that even if they don't satisfy the true threat or harassment standard or the clear and present danger test in some other way, that we should still suppress them because they're awful messages. Who is going to decide? In a society where 53% voted for Donald Trump and substantial majorities voted for people like him at the state and local government all over the country, do we really want government officials to be making these decisions when they are saying that Black Lives Matter protests is hate speech? Yes, several state legislatures have considered proposals to treat Black Lives Matter as a hate group where, as Keith said, that taking the knee has been attacked as hate speech and anti-patriotic speech, even by such an icon as Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Are we going to trust the civil justice system, the criminal justice system, with structural racism, with implicit bias in the individuals who are enforcing these rules, the enormous discretionary power to say, we dislike or hate these messages, and therefore they're going to be suppressed?
So can I ask a follow-up question then? Let's imagine that we understand that the university has speech as well, correct? So let's imagine that the university decides that their speech is to take a shocking message. And what if I, as a university official, stomped on that message as my speech and erased it?
Well,
Is that speech?
First of all, you as an individual definitely have a right to free speech, and you don't give it up by being a university official. You have a right to register your objection to somebody else's speech, but not to the point of obliterating it, is my view, supported by a lot of law. In person, for example, if there are people who wanted to protest here, they could shout briefly, but they could not shout in a sustained manner to completely eliminate our message. I think the analogy would be that you can't completely erase the chalk message, that maybe you could scratch through it or write something disagreeing with it.
Why? What, could I just,
Well,
could I just tear
Keith
down?
wanted to jump in, then we'll
No,
come
I
to you.
just want to ask a question, probably the same question you're going to ask. You mean if somebody writes an offensive chalk message, I can't cover it up with my own chalk message or something?
Well, you as an individual could.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, as an individual. Oh,
University as government.
Okay, all right.
Adam.
Well, I mean, if I saw a poster like that, I would think it's disgusting and I would tear it down. Now, I talked to my friends about how gross it was and about what we could do to stop this kind of hateful attitude. I mean, that's one thing I could do. That's one thing white people should be doing when they see these kinds of attitudes, percolate around the spaces that they inhabit. So that's something we could do. And I don't really know if it would be, I just don't know if it, and I don't really care if it would be legal for me to tear down that poster, because I think I would just do it and somebody could sue me if they thought otherwise. But that's something I could do. That is something I could do. And that is something more white people should do. And I do accept the critique that it shouldn't all be, the burden of fighting these sorts of attitudes should not be placed squarely and only on the shoulders of people of color. That is true. So the rest of us have to take that responsibility for ourselves. White people should organize against racism. We should. And it's got to happen if we're going to get out of this trap that we seem to find ourselves in.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to close for the evening. It is a good closing line. And one of our goals in this whole exercise is to bring racial justice advocates and free speech advocates together in a quest for common ground. I think we had differences on the panel, and we also had a lot of commonalities and things we could all get behind. I found that very encouraging. So I want to, and I hope you'll join me in thanking these wonderful panelists.
I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I want to thank our panelists, as well as, in particular, Suzanne Nossel, who is the Executive Director of PEN America, and the PEN America crew for coming out and helping us to organize this event all day today. Thank you very much, everybody.